Dunbar, Mississippi, 1998. In the suffocating heat of the Mississippi Delta, where the past is never truly buried, a construction crew was tasked with tearing down a ghost. The street, Matthew Industrial Academy, a place of long-forgotten sorrows, was being demolished to make way for a brighter future. But as the machines bit into the earth, they uncovered a secret the town had kept for a generation: dozens of small, unmarked graves. This is not just the story of a tragic discovery. It is the story of a retired teacher's guilty conscience, a pastor's secret archive, and a town forced to confront the horrifying truth of the children it had systematically erased. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now me, tell you the story. The summer of 1998 was a brutal one in Dunbar, Mississippi. The air was a thick, wet blanket, so heavy it felt like you were breathing water, and the sun beat down on the parched earth with a relentless, punishing glare. On the west side of town, where the asphalt gave way to overgrown fields, a construction crew was waging a slow, grinding war against the past. Their enemy was the street, Matthew Industrial Academy, a two-story brick behemoth that had stood abandoned for 20 years, its windows like vacant, staring eyes, its presence a grim, silent monument to a history the town preferred to forget. The plan was to demolish the derelict structure and clear the land for a new, hopeful-sounding housing development. It was an act of civic renewal, of burying the past to make way for the future. But the past, in Dunbar, had a way of refusing to stay buried. The discovery was made by a man named Earl, the operator of a hulking yellow backhoe. He was clearing a thicket of overgrown brush behind the school's old gymnasium when the machine's heavy steel bucket hit something that was not rock or root. There was a dull, sickening crunch. He stopped the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the chirping of the cicadas in the trees. He climbed down from the cab, wiping the sweat from his brow, and peered into the freshly dug earth. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. It was a small, white, and unnaturally smooth object. He reached in and picked it up. It was a bone, a human bone, and it was small, far too small. A cold, prickling dread, a feeling that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat, washed over him. He called his foreman, his voice a low, shaky croak. Within an hour, the construction site had been transformed. The roar of the machinery was replaced by a hushed, reverent silence. The county sheriff, a man whose primary duties usually involved settling property disputes and chasing stray cattle, cordoned off the area with a single, drooping line of yellow tape. The county coroner, a man named Henderson, who was a close friend of the mayor and a firm believer in not stirring up unnecessary trouble, arrived on the scene. He knelt in the dirt, his professional demeanor a thin veneer over his obvious discomfort. The foreman's crew had uncovered more. It was a cluster of them, small, shallow, and completely, utterly unmarked graves. Henderson made his assessment with a swift, almost dismissive efficiency. He stood up, dusted the dirt from his trousers, and addressed the sheriff in a voice loud enough for the construction crew to hear. "It's old," he declared, his tone one of final, unquestionable authority. "Probably from the last century. An old family plot, maybe from before the school was even built. We find these from time to time. They're historic burial plots." He instructed the crew to work around the area, to treat it as a historical site, and promised to file the necessary paperwork. The message was clear. This is not a crime scene. This is a historical inconvenience. But as the construction workers packed up their tools for the day, the whispers began. They were local men. They knew the history of the town. The school had only closed its doors in the late 1972. These weren't ancient graves. They were fresh. And the children who had been sent to street, Matthews, the ones who had supposedly run away, were suddenly and terrifyingly no longer just forgotten stories. The news of the discovery traveled through Dunbar on the invisible, superheated currents of small-town gossip, and it landed on Evelyn Carter's quiet, shaded porch like a physical blow. Now 52 and retired, Evelyn lived a life of deliberate, almost monastic, quiet. Her days were a gentle rhythm of gardening, of reading, of volunteering at the church library. But the news story in the local paper, with its blurry photograph of the yellow tape and its casual mention of historic burial plots, was not a local curiosity to her. It was a ghost, a terrifying, long-suppressed ghost, rattling the locked door of her own memory. A powerful, painful, and deeply unwelcome flashback pulled her back 2 decades, to the late 1970 seconds, to a past she had spent her entire adult life trying to forget. She was a young, idealistic teacher then, fresh out of college, and she had taken a job at the Matthew Industrial Academy, believing, with the fierce, naive passion of youth, that she could make a difference. The place had crushed that idealism within a matter of weeks. Matthews was not a school. It was a place of profound and terrifying neglect, an atmosphere of fear and despair that clung to the very bricks and mortar. The other teachers were not educators. They were wardens, their faces hard and cynical, their methods a brutal, soul-crushing regimen of what they called discipline. Her guilt was not abstract. It was sharp and specific, embodied by the memory of a single, bright but defiant 12-year-old boy. His name was Marcus. He had been sent to Matthews for truancy, but he possessed an intelligent, questioning spirit that the institution was designed to extinguish. He would ask questions in class. He would challenge the authority of the guards, and for that, he was a target. Evelyn remembered the day, a cold, gray afternoon, when he had been accused of stealing an extra piece of cornbread from the cafeteria. He had denied it, his chin held high, his eyes flashing with a righteous and ultimately futile defiance. He was sentenced to 3 days in Reflection Hall, the school's euphemistically named basement isolation room. Evelyn remembered the 2 burly guards dragging him from the classroom, his small body struggling against their overwhelming force. She had stood by, silent, her own fear a cold, paralyzing thing in her stomach. Later that night, while working late in her classroom, she had heard it. The faint, muffled sound of his cries echoing up through the floorboards from the basement below. And then, on the 2nd day, the cries had stopped. There was only a terrifying, absolute silence. When she had asked about him, the headmaster had looked at her with cold, dead eyes and had told her the official story, the one that was used for all the children who were broken by the place. "He ran away," the headmaster had said. "These kids have no loyalty, no gratitude. He's gone." Evelyn, young and intimidated, had said nothing. She had accepted the lie, and in doing so, had become a part of it. The silence of her own complicity had haunted her for 20 years. It was the reason she had left the school and the teaching profession soon after. The news of the graves was not just a story. It was a personal summons, a final, terrifying chance to atone for her silence, to give a name to the ghost that had lived in her memory and her conscience for a generation. To understand the tragedy of Matthews, one had to understand the architecture of neglect upon which it was built. It was a reform school in name only, a convenient, out-of-the-way solution to a problem the county did not want to solve, or even acknowledge. An examination of the school's archives, the few that had survived the decades of deliberate indifference, painted a stark and damning portrait of a segregated correctional facility disguised as an educational institution. The school's admission records, stretching back for decades, showed a chillingly consistent pattern. It exclusively admitted black children, the vast majority of them from what the official paperwork euphemistically called low-income or single-parent homes. Many of the children had been placed there by the juvenile court system for infractions that were, in the context of the town's more affluent white schools, considered minor acts of adolescent rebellion. Skipping class, talking back to a teacher, truancy. But for these children, they were grounds for incarceration. The school was a dumping ground for the county's unwanted, a place to quietly remove the children of the poor and the powerless from public view. While Dunbar's white public schools were properly funded, their buildings maintained, their students given every opportunity to succeed, Matthews was left to decay, a crumbling monument to the county's systemic and deeply ingrained racism. Life inside the academy was a daily struggle for survival. The food was a thin, watery gruel, the blankets were threadbare, and the dormitories were cold, damp, and infested. Medical care was a cruel joke. There was no school nurse, no infirmary. Sickness was seen as a sign of weakness, an inconvenience to the school's rigid, disciplinary routine. Malnutrition, untreated infections, and accidents resulting from the harsh and often violent. Punishments were frequent, but almost entirely undocumented. The children were not students. They were inmates, their childhoods being systematically ground down by a machine of pure, unadulterated neglect. The institution was not designed to reform. It was designed to break. It was a place where a child's spirit, their hope, their very will to live, was seen not as something to be nurtured, but as something to be extinguished. It was a slow, quiet, and state-sanctioned destruction of a generation of forgotten children. The horrors of Street Matthews were not a well-kept secret. They were an open one, a truth that was deliberately and systematically ignored by every level of authority in the county. The architecture of the cover-up was as solid and as imposing as the school's own brick walls. For decades, when parents, frantic with worry about a child who had supposedly run away but had never been seen again, tried to raise the alarm, they were met with a wall of dismissive, prejudiced, and deeply insulting bureaucracy. Flashbacks to the 1,970 seconds reveal a pattern of official suppression. A heart-wrenching scene shows a young mother clutching a faded photograph of her son, sitting in the sterile, unwelcoming office of the county sheriff. She is trying to explain that her son, a boy with a profound fear of the dark, would never have run away from the school in the middle of the night. The sheriff, a man who sees her not as a concerned parent but as an emotional, unreliable nuisance, listens with a kind of bored, paternalistic patience. He tells her that her son is probably just being rebellious, that he'll turn up in a few days, and that she needs to go home and let the professionals handle it. Her complaint is never officially filed. The true architect of the silence, however, was a young, ambitious, and deeply cunning man who was, at the time, the superintendent of the school, Leonard Dorsey. An old, archived memo, unearthed from a dusty, forgotten box in the courthouse basement, reveals his central role in the cover-up. The memo, written in response to a rare inquiry from a state-level education board about an unexplained student death at the academy, is a masterpiece of political deflection and veiled racism. In it, Dorsey warns against launching a formal inquiry, stating with a chilling, calculated pragmatism, "We must avoid stirring unnecessary racial tension at all costs." He reframes the death as a tragic but unavoidable accident and assures the board that the school's disciplinary methods, while firm, are necessary for the type of student we serve. The state itself was a willing accomplice in this conspiracy of silence. The narrator reveals that state inspectors, who were legally required to visit the school annually, did so only twice in a 10-year period. And in both cases, the visits were pre-announced weeks in advance, giving the school staff ample time to scrub the floors, to put on a show of order and cleanliness, to hide the sick children, and to present a carefully constructed illusion of a well-run institution. It was a system designed not to find the truth, but to ratify the lie. A cycle of willful blindness that ensured the screams from within the walls of Street Matthews would never reach the outside world. The discovery of the graves was not just a news story for Evelyn Carter. It was a moral reckoning. The guilt that had been a quiet, constant companion for 20 years now became a loud, screaming, and unavoidable presence in her life. She could no longer live with the silence. The image of Marcus, the defiant 12-year-old boy, his face a mixture of fear and pride as he was dragged away, was a ghost that would not let her rest. She had been a witness, and her silence had been a form of complicity. Now, 20 years too late, she had to become a voice. She knew she couldn't do it alone. The forces that had kept the secret for so long were still in power, still woven into the very fabric of the town. She needed an ally, someone who knew the community, who understood its hidden history, and who possessed the moral authority to stand against the tide. She needed Reverend Samuel Price. The Reverend was the moral and historical conscience of Dunbar's black community. A man in his early 60s, he had been the pastor of the local AME Zion Church for over 30 years. His church was not just a place of worship. It was a sanctuary, a community center, a court of last resort for those whom the official systems had failed. For decades, when families had nowhere else to turn, when the sheriff's department had dismissed their missing children as runaways, they had turned to the Reverend. Evelyn found him in his small, book-lined office at the back of the church, a place that smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and a deep, abiding faith. She told him her story, her voice a low, trembling whisper as she recounted the horrors she had witnessed at Street Matthews, her confession of her own long-held silence, a painful, cathartic unburdening. The Reverend listened, his face a mask of profound, sorrowful empathy. He was not surprised. He had heard whispers, fragments of stories like hers. For years, when she was finished, he didn't offer her platitudes or prayers. He offered her something far more powerful, proof that she was not alone. He walked over to a large, locked, 4-drawer file cabinet in the corner of his office, a piece of furniture that seemed as old as the church itself. He unlocked it, the sound of the key turning in the old lock, a loud, decisive click in the quiet room. He pulled open a drawer. It was filled, from front to back, with neatly organized manila folders, his unofficial archive of the lost. He pulled out a folder and laid it on the desk before her. Inside was a faded Polaroid photograph of a young boy with a mischievous, gapped-tooth grin. Beneath it was a letter, written in a mother's desperate, looping cursive, pleading for help in finding her son, a boy who had run away from Street Matthews. The boy in the photograph was Marcus. In that moment, Evelyn's lonely, guilt-ridden memory was transformed into a shared, verifiable history. Her fight was no longer just for her own atonement. It was for him, and for all the other forgotten faces in the Reverend's sacred files. The alliance between the retired teacher and the steadfast pastor became a quiet, determined, and deeply methodical investigation. Reverend Price's office was transformed into their war room, the long-held secrets of his filing cabinet now spread across his large oak desk. The work was painstaking, a slow and often heartbreaking process of piecing together a puzzle that had been deliberately scattered to the winds 2 decades ago. They began by cross-referencing Evelyn's memories with the Reverend's records. Evelyn, her mind now sharp and focused, would recall a name, a face, a small, forgotten detail about a child who had vanished, and the Reverend would search his archives, often producing a faded photograph or a desperate, pleading letter from a family that confirmed her memory. One by one, they began to build a list, a roll call of the runaways, the children who had been swallowed by the silence of Street Matthews. It was a sacred, terrible, and deeply emotional process of resurrection, of pulling names and faces from the abyss of the forgotten. The first major breakthrough, the first thread that would begin to unravel the entire decades-long cover-up, came from Evelyn herself. Haunted by the memory of Marcus, she returned to her own dusty attic, to a collection of old cardboard boxes filled with the forgotten relics of her brief and painful teaching career. She was searching for anything, a lesson plan, a class roster that might have his name on it. After hours of sifting through yellowed papers that smelled of time and regret, she found it. It was a thin, carbon copy booklet of disciplinary transfer forms, a piece of bureaucratic ephemera she had unthinkingly packed away 20 years ago. And there it was, a form dated from the week Marcus had vanished. It detailed his infraction, insolence, and theft of foodstuffs, and authorized his transfer for a period of 3 days to Reflection Hall for intensive behavioral correction. It was the official, damning record of the moment he had been sent to the basement. And at the bottom of the form, in a bold, confident, and now utterly chilling script, was the authorizing signature of the school's then superintendent, the man who had built his entire successful political career on his reputation as a compassionate community leader, Leonard Dorsey. It was the first, hard, undeniable piece of evidence that linked the current, beloved mayor directly to the dark, hidden machinery of the school's brutal and ultimately fatal disciplinary system. As the local newspaper began to tentatively ask more questions, spurred on by a series of anonymous, carefully worded tips from Reverend Price, the story of the historic burial plots began to attract the attention of the state-level media. The pressure mounted, and the state, facing the prospect of a political and public relations nightmare, was forced to act. They assigned an investigator from the state's cold case unit to look into the matter. Her name was Detective Carla Jennings. She arrived in Dunbar not like a savior, but like a surgeon, her approach clinical, dispassionate, and deeply skeptical. She was a sharp, pragmatic, and highly professional investigator in her late 30s, a woman who had risen through the ranks of a predominantly white, male-dominated state police force by being twice as good, twice as tough, and 10 times as logical as her peers. She operated strictly by the book, and she had a deep, almost visceral, distrust of local legends, small-town rumors, and emotionally driven accusations that were not supported by hard, verifiable evidence. Her initial interview with Evelyn Carter was a tense, frustrating exercise in professional skepticism. She saw Evelyn not as a key witness, but as a potential liability, a well-meaning but emotionally compromised woman whose memories, 20 years old, and colored by a deep and self-admitted guilt, were likely to be unreliable. She listened to Evelyn's story, her face an unreadable mask, her pen making sharp, precise notes in her legal pad. She asked probing, almost prosecutorial questions, searching for inconsistencies, for holes, for the kind of emotional embellishment she had seen in 100 other similar cases. "Miss Carter," she said, her tone polite but firm, "you're asking me to believe that a respected public official, the mayor of this town, was involved in a conspiracy to cover up the deaths of children over 2 decades ago, based on a single, uncorroborated memory of a boy you thought you heard crying in a basement. You understand how that sounds, don't you?" Evelyn, her own frustration mounting, pushed the copy of the disciplinary transfer form across the table. "That is the mayor's signature, Detective, on a form that sent a 12-year-old boy to an isolation cell from which he never returned. That's not a memory. That's a fact." Jennings looked at the form, her expression unchanging. It was a single, flimsy piece of paper from a bygone era. It was interesting, but it wasn't enough. The case was a political hot potato, a Pandora's box of racial tension and historical grievances that her superiors wanted closed as quickly and as quietly as possible. Her initial motivation was not to uncover a conspiracy, but to conduct a professional, airtight, and ultimately limited investigation that would satisfy the media and allow the state to move on. She left the interview with Evelyn's file, but with her skepticism firmly and professionally intact. Evelyn Carter knew she had not convinced the skeptical detective. She could see it in Jennings's eyes, the cool, professional distance, the barely concealed doubt. She knew that the investigation, in Jennings's hands, would likely die a slow, bureaucratic death, another file to be stamped unsubstantiated and relegated to the archives. Evelyn couldn't let that happen. The ghosts of Street Matthews and her own, long-suppressed conscience were screaming too loudly. She had to give the detective something more, something so real and so terrible that it could not be dismissed or explained away. Her memory, now fully and painfully unlocked, was her only remaining weapon. She remembered a detail from her time at the school, a strange, architectural anomaly that had never made sense to her. In the school's large, cavernous cellar, a space used for storage and as the laundry, there was a section of the wall that was different. It was newer brick, the mortar a lighter color, a clumsy, obvious patch on the original, 19th century foundation. The official story had been that it was a repair from an old, long-forgotten flood, but it had always looked to Evelyn less like a repair and more like a seal. She called Detective Jennings, her voice a mixture of desperate pleading and a new, strange certainty. "You have to come back," she said. "There's something at the school you need to see. Something that's not on any of the blueprints." Reluctantly, and likely against her better judgment, Jennings agreed to meet her at the now fenced-off demolition site. Guided by Evelyn's memory, they descended into the school's dark, musty cellar. The air was thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. Evelyn led the detective to the back of the cellar, to the wall beneath the old laundry wing. And there it was, the patch of newer brick, a clumsy, obvious scar on the old stone. Jennings ran her hand over the rough surface, her professional skepticism warring with a dawning and deeply unsettling curiosity. It was, as Evelyn had said, an anomaly. With Evelyn's testimony as a guide, Jennings was able to secure a limited, exploratory warrant. The next day, she returned with a small team. They broke down the wall. The space behind it was not a part of the original foundation. It was a hidden, man-made horror. They had uncovered a series of small, dark, and windowless cells, each one barely large enough for a single, small body. Bolted to the walls of each cell were rusted, iron restraints. In a corner of the main hidden chamber, they found a small, rotting wooden box. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like old, dried straw, were dozens of small, numbered, metal medical tags, the kind used to identify bodies in a morgue. It was a scene of unimaginable, systematic cruelty. It was the physical, undeniable, and horrifying proof of everything Evelyn had been saying. For Detective Carla Jennings, this was the moment the case, and her entire understanding of the quiet, sleepy town of Dunbar, was blown wide open. The rumors had just become terrifyingly and undeniably real. The discovery of the hidden cells was a seismic event, a shock wave that threatened to shatter the placid, carefully constructed surface of Dunbar. The investigation, which had been a quiet, tentative affair, now gained a new, and for Mayor Leonard Dorsey, a deeply threatening momentum. The ghosts of Street Matthews were no longer just whispers. They were screaming, and their screams were beginning to reach the outside world. Mayor Dorsey, the man who had built his entire, successful political career on his image as a calm, compassionate, and steady-handed leader, began to actively and aggressively fight back. He was a master of the subtle political knife fight, and he now unsheathed his weapons. He began to leverage the full weight of his political power to obstruct, to delay, and to discredit the investigation. His first move was bureaucratic, citing a sudden and completely fabricated county budget crisis. He blocked all municipal funding for a full-scale, forensic excavation of the school grounds. The initial, small discovery of graves was one thing. A full professional exhumation was another, a process that could unearth a truth he could no longer control or contain. His next move was public. He held a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse, his face a mask of calm mayoral authority, his tone one of deep, sorrowful concern for the town he led. He spoke of the need for healing, for unity, for not letting the unfortunate, but long past, events of a different era divide their community. He dismissed the investigation as a politically motivated and deeply irresponsible attempt to dig up the past and reopen old wounds for personal, political gain. He was reframing the search for justice as an act of civic disruption, and himself as the noble protector of the town's fragile peace. And finally, he delivered the lie that was designed to be the final, impenetrable wall around the truth. When questioned by a reporter from a state newspaper about the school's official records, the records that could confirm the names and fates of the missing children, he sighed, a deep, theatrical sound of profound, bureaucratic regret. "Unfortunately," he said, his voice laced with a perfect false sincerity. "As many of you know, the courthouse basement was subject to a severe flood back in the early 80s. The vast majority of the county's archived records from that era, including, tragically, those from the old Street Matthews School, were lost. It's a terrible loss of our town's history, but it is, I'm afraid, a loss that is permanent. It was a brilliant and completely unverifiable lie, a convenient act of God that was designed to be the final damning word on the matter, the last shovelful of dirt on a secret he was determined to keep buried." The news of the mayor's press conference, of his smooth political deflection and his convenient, unverifiable lies, reached a small, sterile, and quiet room in a nursing home on the other side of the county. In that room sat a man named Silas, a man in his late 70s, his body frail, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his mind haunted by a secret he had carried, like a heavy, leaden weight for over 2 decades. Silas had been a janitor at St. Matthew's, a silent, invisible presence who had seen everything, who had been a part of everything, and who had been too terrified to ever speak of it. The mayor's public denial, his casual, arrogant dismissal of the graves, of the children, was the one thing that his conscience, heavy and burdened for so long, could no longer bear. The fear that had kept him silent for a generation was finally, and completely, eclipsed by the need to tell the truth. He knew he was nearing the end of his own life, and he could not, would not, meet his Maker with this terrible, silent sin still on his soul. He contacted the one man in Dunbar he knew he could trust, the one man who had been a quiet, steady beacon of morality in a town that had lost its way, Reverend Price. The Reverend, recognizing the momentous and potentially fragile nature of the call, arranged a secret meeting, not at the church, not at the nursing home, but at Evelyn Carter's own, quiet and private home. Silas arrived, driven by his son, his face a pale, terrified mask, his body trembling. He sat in Evelyn's comfortable, sunlit living room, a place of peace that was a universe away from the dark, terrible memories he was about to unearth. His voice, when he began to speak, was a hoarse, ragged whisper, the sound of a voice that had not spoken of these things in 20 long, silent years. He told them everything. He told them about Reflection Hall, about the sounds he would hear from behind the locked basement door. He told them about the headmaster, about the guards, about the culture of absolute, brutal authority. And then, his voice cracking, the tears he had held back for 2 decades finally streaming down his wrinkled, weathered face, he told them the final, most horrifying part of the secret. They called it discipline, he confessed, his body racked with sobs. They'd take the kids down there, the ones who fought back, the ones who wouldn't break. And sometimes the kids never came out. The headmaster, he'd just say they'd run off. But they hadn't. He'd come to me, late at night. He'd tell me there was a package to take care of. We were told to just bury them, out back, behind the gym, where the ground was soft. No fuss, no headstones, no names. The order was always the same. Keep it quiet, Silas. Just keep it quiet. His confession, the unburdening of a lifetime of guilt, hung in the silent, sunlit room, a story of such profound, unimaginable horror that it seemed to suck all the air from the world. Evelyn Carter sat across from the old, weeping man, her own heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. She was listening to the voice of her own, long-buried nightmare, a confirmation of the truth she had suspected and had been too afraid to confront for 20 long years. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrible and clarifying, that this man's confession was the key. It was the why and the how that the investigation had been missing. But she also knew, with the cold, pragmatic mind that was now her greatest asset, that his testimony, as powerful as it was, would never be enough. Silas was a terrified, elderly man in poor health. He would never have the courage to go to the police, to face the inevitable, brutal cross-examination from a lawyer hired by the mayor. His story would be dismissed as the confused, unreliable ramblings of a senile old man. His credibility would be shredded, and the truth, which had come so close to the surface, would be buried again, this time forever. In that moment, Evelyn made a choice, a moral calculation that was as difficult as it was necessary. She knew that the janitor's trust was fragile, that his confession was a sacred and deeply personal act, but she also knew that the truth, the names of the children buried in the dirt, was more sacred still. She reached into her purse, her hand closing around the small, cold, metallic shape of the microcassette recorder she had bought a few days before, a tool she had hoped she would never have to use. With a single, silent, and almost imperceptible movement of her thumb, she pressed the record button. She began to ask him questions, her voice soft, gentle, and full of a deep, genuine empathy that was not an act. She asked him to tell her the story again, from the beginning. She asked him for details, for names, for dates, and Silas, his own emotional floodgates now wide open, told her everything again. His voice still a hoarse, ragged whisper, but now recorded, his terrible, truthful words being captured, preserved, and transformed from a fleeting, deniable memory into a hard, undeniable, and permanent piece of evidence. It was an act of betrayal, of a kind. She was violating the sacred trust of a confession, but it was also an act of profound and desperate justice, the only way she knew to give the ghosts of Street Matthews their own, final, and irrefutable testimony. The recording was a bomb, and Evelyn Carter knew that she could not be the one to detonate it. She was still, in the eyes of the public and the local authorities, a biased, emotionally compromised witness. The official investigation, now under the command of a reluctant and deeply skeptical Detective Jennings, was stalled, its progress deliberately and systematically blocked by Mayor Dorsey's political machinations. The wall of silence, though cracked, was still standing. To break it, they needed to go around it. They needed to take their case to a higher, more powerful, and more independent authority, the press. Reverend Price, with his deep and quiet connections throughout the state, knew just the person. He arranged a clandestine meeting with a senior investigative journalist from a major state newspaper, a man with a reputation for integrity, for fearlessness, and for a deep and often inconvenient commitment to the truth. The meeting took place in the back room of a small, anonymous diner in a town 50 miles away from Dunbar, a place where no one would know their faces. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and fried bacon. Evelyn, her hands trembling slightly, placed the small gray plastic microcassette recorder on the table between them. She and the Reverend told the journalist the entire story, from the beginning. They told him about Street Matthews, about the missing children, about the wall of official indifference. They showed him the disciplinary transfer form, with Mayor Dorsey's signature, a stark, damning accusation from the past. And then, they played the tape. The journalist, a man who had heard 1,000 stories of corruption and deceit, listened in stunned, horrified silence. The audio was grainy, the quality poor, but the content was a cannonball blast through the placid surface of the state's political landscape. The janitor's voice, a hoarse, terrified, and deeply authentic whisper, filled the small room, his confession a story of such profound, institutional evil that it was almost impossible to believe. The journalist didn't need to be convinced. He knew this was the story of a lifetime, a story that could bring down powerful men and expose a rot that went to the very heart of the state's history. The decision was made. They would leak the tape. It was their one, single, and final shot at breaking through the wall of silence. It was a declaration of war, a match thrown on a pool of gasoline, an act that they knew would either force the truth into the light or get them all buried in the darkness. The story broke on a Sunday morning, and it was not just a story, it was a firestorm. The newspaper had dedicated its entire front page to the tragedy of Street Matthews. The headline was a stark, powerful, and deeply damning accusation. The ghosts of Dunbar. Secret recording accuses mayor. Former school officials in decades-long cover-up of child deaths. The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, but its heart, its undeniable and horrifying power, was the audio of the janitor's confession, which the newspaper had posted on its website. The story was immediately picked up by the state, and then the national news networks. The audio, the grainy, terrified, and deeply authentic whisper of Silas, was played on a loop, his heartbreaking confession, a story of such profound and institutional evil that it shocked the conscience of the state and the nation. The reaction was immediate, and it was explosive. The narrative was no longer a local, historical dispute. It was a statewide, and then a national, scandal. Protests, led by a coalition of civil rights groups and religious leaders organized by Reverend Price, erupted on the steps of the state capitol. The national media descended on the small, quiet town of Dunbar, their satellite trucks a jarring, modern intrusion on the rural landscape, their cameras and their questions a white-hot spotlight on a town that had, for so long, thrived in the shadows. The governor, a man who had close political ties to Mayor Dorsey, found himself in the middle of a political firestorm he could not control. His office was inundated with calls, his press conferences dominated by questions about the state's own historical failure to properly oversee the reform school. Faced with a full-blown political crisis and the undeniable, horrifying evidence of the audio recording, he had no choice. He held a press conference, his face a grim, unhappy mask, and announced that he was calling for a full, independent, federal inquiry into the matter. The wall of silence, the wall that had stood for decades, the wall that had been so carefully constructed and so ruthlessly maintained, had not just been cracked, it had been blown apart. The arrival of the federal investigators in Dunbar was like the arrival of an invading army. They were not from here. They owed no allegiance to the local powers, to the old, unwritten rules of the town's social and political hierarchy. They were outsiders, their presence a clear and deeply unsettling signal that the town's long-held secrets were no longer its own to keep. The forensic experts who descended on the grounds of the old St. Matthew's School were a different breed from the local coroner who had so quickly and so conveniently dismissed the graves. They were a team of highly trained, professional, and deeply serious scientists, their approach a cold, dispassionate, and relentless pursuit of the empirical truth. They took over the site, their white vans and their sterile high-tech equipment a stark, modern contrast to the old, decaying brick of the school. The full-scale, professional exhumation began, and the truth, which had been whispered and rumored for so long, was now, finally, being unearthed, piece by heartbreaking piece. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply, profoundly grim. The forensic anthropologists, working with the delicate, patient tools of an archaeologist, began to tell the story of the children in the dirt. Their findings were a scientific and utterly horrifying confirmation of everything Evelyn and the janitor had said. The unmarked graves, they determined, contained the bodies of dozens of children, their ages ranging from 8 to 14. The forensic evidence on their small, fragile bones was a silent, screaming testament to the lives they had led and the deaths they had suffered. The reports, when they were finally compiled, were a clinical, dispassionate, and utterly damning litany of horrors. The children's deaths, the experts concluded, were consistent with extreme neglect, prolonged restraint, and untreated illness. They found evidence of malnutrition in the underdeveloped bones. They found healed fractures, the telltale signs of a long history of physical abuse. They found that the children in the dirt, the runaways that the town had so easily forgotten, had not run away at all. They had been the victims of a slow, quiet, and systematic destruction, their lives extinguished by a profound and monstrous indifference. The forensic report was a legal and political earthquake, a shockwave that shattered the last remaining vestiges of Mayor Leonard Dorsey's carefully constructed fortress of lies. The scientific evidence was irrefutable, the testimony of the bones undeniable. The historic burial plots were a mass grave. The unfortunate accidents were a pattern of fatal neglect. The different time was a period of systematic, criminal cruelty. Faced with the irrefutable evidence, the threat of impending federal charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy, and the complete and utter collapse of his political career, Mayor Leonard Dorsey, the man who had been the face of Dunbar for a generation, resigned in disgrace. His resignation was a quiet, ignominious affair. A short, typed letter delivered to the town council in the middle of the night, a final, cowardly retreat from the truth he could no longer outrun. A federal grand jury was convened, and the wall of silence, which had protected the secrets of St. Matthew's for so long, came crashing down. Subpoenas were issued for all surviving former staff of the academy, the guards, the administrators, the teachers who had stayed silent. One by one, they were forced to testify, their old, comfortable lies crumbling under the weight of the federal investigation and the threat of perjury charges. The stories they told, the secrets they had kept, painted a portrait of an institution that was not just negligent, but was, in its very soul, evil. The system, forced by the unrelenting pressure of the media, the public, and now the federal government, was finally, and belatedly, beginning to work. A year later, on a bright, cool autumn afternoon, A new and very different kind of gathering was held on the grounds of the former street, Matthew Industrial Academy. The old, menacing brick building was gone, razed to the ground, its foundations salted and buried, as if to physically erase the stain of its memory from the earth. In its place was a small, quiet, and beautiful memorial park. At the center of the park was a simple, elegant wall of polished, black granite, a silent, powerful testament to the lives that had been lost and found on this haunted ground. Etched into the stone, in neat, clean, and permanent letters, were the names of the children of Street, Matthews, the names that Evelyn and the Reverend had so painstakingly resurrected from the archives of the forgotten. Evelyn Carter stood at the memorial, her hand resting on the cool, smooth stone, her fingers tracing the letters of Marcus's name. She was surrounded by the surviving families of the lost, their hands clutching the same faded, precious photographs that the Reverend had kept safe for so long. The air was not filled with the sounds of rage or protest, but with a quiet, somber, and deeply profound sense of peace. Detective Carla Jennings stood beside her, her own journey from skeptic to believer now complete. She looked at the wall, at the long list of names, and then at the quiet, dignified woman who had been the catalyst for it all. "You did right by them, Evelyn," she said, her voice a low, respectful murmur. Evelyn looked at the names etched in the stone, her eyes filled with a sad, quiet, and hard-won peace. Her long, lonely, and thankless fight was over. The ghosts of her memory had finally been laid to rest. "Not in time," she replied, her voice a quiet, powerful whisper that carried the weight of a lifetime of regret and a final measure of redemption. But finally. The final shot of the story is of the late afternoon sun glinting off the memorial plaque, the names that were once erased by a system of indifference now, at long, long last, set in stone forever.